Today, we continue our series on the swing states of 2024, the 7 states that will determine the race for the White House. We turn to North Carolina and to the Charlotte News and Observer's Danielle Battaglia, a political veteran who knows as well as anyone what each team must do to prevail as the polls point to a very tight finish. From Ballard Studios in Washington, D.C., another election edition of 13th and Park.
You and I can differ, but that doesn't mean you and I cannot be friends.
That often is missing in politics.
We went from North Korea to M&M. That's a lot, man.
Aliens could have invaded and nothing would surprise me at this point.
It's a nightmare.
Those are the facts.
We have to solve everything.
What's in this tea?
Danielle, welcome to the show. We were talking before we began here about your visit to Milwaukee and the balloons that were bursting days after Donald Trump had survived, an assassination attempt. That must have been one for the books.
Yeah, thank you for having me. It was definitely very interesting just hearing the balloons pop right after seeing the gunfire towards him. I could not believe he could not flinch at that. And we were all the ones panicking, hearing, what sounded like gunfire, but it was just balloons.
Nate Silver projects that if Kamala Harris were to win in North Carolina, she'll win the presidency. And yet this is a state that has only gone for 2 Democrats in the last 50 years, Jimmy Carter and Barack Obama. So what gives Democrats reason to believe that 2024 might be different than most of the other elections that preceded it?
The thing to remember with North Carolina is even though Democrats don't often win, the margin they lose by is so slim that there's always a chance that they could pull it off. And we've seen both when Biden was running for re-election and then with Vice President Kamala Harris taking over his campaign, they have just pushed so much effort, time, resources into North Carolina and trying to win this race. So I think they have a lot of hope that this is their year.
As we know, the vice president, right after the debate with Donald Trump, her first thought was Charlotte. So that probably is an indication of intention, right?
Yeah, and there's been a lot of that. We saw that also with President Biden right after his debate against Donald Trump. He came straight to Raleigh overnight. I think he landed at 2:30 in the morning and had a rally that day. We've seen it with Kamala Harris every time something big happens. She's in our state pretty quickly after, if not the next day, within days of it happening. So we have seen so much just push from them to be in North Carolina and present.
What should people look for in North Carolina in 24, as we say, on the margins, where in a very tight election, a difference could really be made?
What's interesting with North Carolina and the population of it, I actually just did a talk with Chris Cooper, who's a political scientist from our state last night. And we were talking about North Carolina is so incredibly rural, and those rural voters count, and they often go far right. So they are our Republican voters. And while we have these major pockets of Democrats or moderate groups in the cities, the amount of rural areas that do go Republican do actually shape North Carolina's election. And so I think with this election, it's going to be so tight. I don't even know how to predict which way it's going to go.
You talked about the rural areas. Obviously, I'm a Floridian, and we just gotten through the horrors of a second hurricane and a hurricane that visited as well, the first one, Helene, North Carolina. What impact could that hurricane and the aftermath of the hurricane have on voter turnout? Because obviously places like Asheville and other places west really got hit pretty hard.
Yeah, we're watching that really closely. I think there were about 25 counties out of our 100 counties that were really damaged. And this is damaging our polling places. It's damaging our early stop locations. And it's also displaced a lot of people. That same political science professor was saying last night that his fathers had to move out of state just from the damage.
Wow.
So that's one less voter North Carolina has. And I'm sure he's not an outlier in that of trying to just relocate until they can rebuild their communities. And so I think just trying to figure out where our different voters have ended up, whether they even take the time to remember that they can still do vote by mail, trying to figure out where their precincts are, it's going to have a major impact. What's interesting about this region, again, very rural, except you have Asheville in the center of it, which is a very liberal city.
Very liberal, right?
So I think it would hurt Donald Trump more to not have those voters, but with that one hub in there, it could also hurt Kamala Harris if people are not showing up.
Well, one of the wrinkles, of course, in the election in North Carolina to come is the fact that Robert Kennedy Jr. is no longer on the ballot, right? The state Supreme Court took his name off the ballot. What impact could that have? Again, in a razor-thin election, I think most people expect in North Carolina this fall.
I do think, he was siphoning some of the votes away from the candidates. And so to not have him on the ballot would bring those back to most likely Trump, but possibly Kamala Harris, depending on where they landed. And so I think, one less candidate on the ballot's always going to make a slight difference, although his margins weren't great in North Carolina for winning.
He had great hopes and a great name, right?
Hopes.
So as you know, the biggest registration in the state is unaffiliated. I think it's like 40% are unaffiliated. Who are these unaffiliated voters in terms of those who are still persuadable? And what do you think it will take to move them?
Our unaffiliated voters, we find, typically do have a partisan lean that they tend to go towards. So these are people who don't want to commit to one person or one group, but they want to be able to vote how they want to, but they also do tend to have a home that they go to. So it depends on how extreme that candidate is and whether that candidate can bring them back into the fold or whether they're too extreme and they go the opposite direction.
What do you think is kind of top of mind to people there in the swing areas of a swing state like North Carolina?
I always felt like it was going to be the economy. And there's a lot of discussion about we can't afford to buy groceries. That's something I overwhelmingly hear from North Carolina voters. I do wonder both how climate change and disaster relief will now play into that discussion, given what's happened in the last 2 weeks with Hurricane Helene. Immigration is always an issue, especially in those rural areas. Our local sheriffs are constantly talking about the fentanyl crisis and how it's coming across the border. And so there's a big push to build the wall. Those are probably the bigger issues that we're hearing right now.
But you said, disaster response.
Yeah.
Again, as a Floridian, I can tell you the worst part of a natural disaster is after the fact. After the adrenaline is worn off and the danger has passed, you're left with destruction. Usually, as the blame game begins, there's always a blame game. It usually is visited on those that are in power, fairly or not. And when you have a natural disaster like this, it's a combination of state and federal. But federal usually gets the brunt of it. Obviously, the vice president, Kamala Harris, is trying to nip that in the bud as best she can. But it's not so easy to do with just a visit into the state once in a while when you have lingering effects that are going to affect some families for a very long time.
Yeah, and I think this one's been interesting if you have followed what's been going on with the aftermath of the storm. There's been so much disinformation coming out to the point that members of Congress have had to put up fact sheets about what's real and what's not on their website. The blame has definitely started to come out with different lawmakers pointing fingers at each other. There's obviously a rift between our lieutenant governor and our governor right now.
Right.
What I've heard overwhelmingly is that FEMA and the national level did a great job with the response. We're starting to see some of the blame be placed on the governor. We saw that with the lieutenant governor, again, not getting along. So take that for what it's worth. But yeah, that is definitely starting to erode in the state.
Well, needless to say, no surprise to you, the governor's race has gotten a lot of ink recently, right?
Yeah.
As Mark Robinson suddenly was kind of brought down to earth with things I'm sure he never expected to surface. What impact could that possibly have, Danielle, on even up ballot? Usually you think it's top of ballot down. Could there be any reverse effect from the governor's race of kind of down ballot up?
I think with former President Trump and his campaign, he's always been very linked to Robinson. He's supported him. He's kind of helped boost his national platform. So I think that it could affect the former president. However, even before these remarks came out, Robinson wasn't doing well in the polls, and that included with the former president's own voters and supporters. They were not liking Robinson. So I don't know how that affects this. But down ballot, I think it could definitely have a domino effect of the people who tied themselves to Robinson.
So North Carolina is a swing state, but also is a state that's not immune to splitting tickets. So could that be a situation here where Donald Trump could win North Carolina, maybe even more than by a close margin, and the GOP candidate for governor could go down to inglorious defeat?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, we saw that in 2020 with Donald Trump winning the presidency, and then with Governor Cooper, who's a Democrat, winning the ballot. We've seen this many times before. I think we kind of expect that this time. Robinson's down at least double digits now. I think he's getting close to 20 points down from Stein. So I expect to see Stein win and to be seen who's going to be our president. But it's very possible that it could be Donald Trump winning North Carolina and we'd have a split ticket. That's not unusual at all for us.
So one thing that unfortunately Americans are just going to have to grin and bear is there won't be probably a fast decision on who's president by the morning after the election, right? Will the count in North Carolina, in your opinion, be relatively efficient and fast? In other words, will we really know where Trump and Harris stand the morning after?
This is not to take away from my Board of Elections workers who are great and doing a really hard job. I am in charge of covering North Carolina's presidential election that night, and I expect to be up till the wee hours of the morning and probably not have results that night. That is my gut instinct. I don't know that from any forecasting that. I just our margins are so close. I just think it's going to come down to the wire for us.
So it won't be because of the process or which absentee ballots are legitimate, which ones aren't. It's going to be more about the fact your opinion is that it'll be more traceable to it, just going to be close.
I'm worried about the closeness of it. I do think that with all the litigation that we've seen coming out of North Carolina leading up to the election, I think there could be some setup for some arguments and fights about the legitimacy of the election going past November 5th. So I have concerns on both levels of that.
Tell us how the North Carolina Supreme Court is ideologically, is it partisan?
Yeah, we have a very partisan Supreme Court. I don't remember when that changed, that they made it partisan, but they are very Republican, very focused on Republican ideals. And so whenever Democrats bring a lawsuit forward, it does not often go their way.
So is it possible the North Carolina Supreme Court may be the most important vote of all? And if it is, in fact, very tight?
Yeah, I would be watching that vote very closely. There's a lot of Republican power on that Supreme Court bench. And I used to cover courts exclusively as my job. And the amount of focus that the elections of judges gets is so minuscule, but so important that, I wish people would pay more attention to that because it does make a huge difference.
Well, I wish you all the best in whatever is about to happen. You do a tremendous job of keeping people up to speed and informed, which is the most important part of democracy. North Carolina is on everyone's list. If Kamala Harris does prevail there, obviously that is very bad news for Donald Trump. If Donald Trump prevails and history holds, then maybe the pressure's off a little bit after the election in North Carolina as the others start to go down to places like Fulton County, Georgia, to figure out what the heck happened and where are we headed with all this.
Yeah. Thank you so much for having me too. I appreciate it.
Be good.